Well, welcome to the 2025 Workforce Development Committee meeting. My name is Wendy Strack, Chair of the committee. Before we convene, I'd like to remind everyone present that the board is a consumer protection agency charged with administering and enforcing the board's laws. Where the protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be paramount. Committee members will be participating remotely from private, non-public sites. The public may participate in person or remotely, or by attending in person at DCA headquarters at 1625 North Market Boulevard, Suite S102. Announce when we are accepting public comment on the various issues, and the meeting moderator will open the lines as appropriate. Each commenter will have 2 minutes to comment. Moderator, would you please provide the audience instructions as to how they may participate during the meeting at the appropriate time?
Sure. This is the moderator. When we go to public comment on WebEx, I will open up the Q&A panel for public comment. You can either use the Q&A feature to submit public comment by typing the word comment, or you can use the raise hand feature, which should be next to your WebEx name. Once again, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning, and at the end of your time, your microphone will be muted, and we'll move on to the next individual requesting public comment. Thank you, moderator. I'd like to now call the meeting to order and ask Christina to call roll to establish a quorum.
Good morning. Wendy Strack.
Present. Public member.
Justin Huff.
Present. LMFT member.
Eleanor Uribe.
Present. LCSW member.
Dr. Annette Walker.
Present. Public board member.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Christina. And board staff, would you please introduce yourselves?
Steve Sodergren, Executive Officer. Darla McManus, Assistant Executive Officer.
Roseanne Helms, Legislative Manager for the board. Sarita Risso, Special Projects and Research Analyst for the board. Sabina Knight, Legal Counsel for the board.
That sounds like it. Now's the time for the public to introduce themselves if they'd like. This is voluntary. Is there anyone in person there that would like to introduce themselves?
There is. Good morning, Shanti Ezrin, California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists.
Steve Tippett.
Whoever's speaking in the hearing room right now, we can't hear, or at least I can't. I don't know if my colleagues can.
Can you hear me yet? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Christine Tippett. I help the board when they ask me to. I'm a clinical supervisor. I'm an psychotherapist. I'm a clinical consultant. I'm a clinical professor. I do whatever I can do in any way possible.
I'm sorry. We still were having trouble hearing there, but
that's Christine Tippett. She has been a subject matter expert for the board and has a lot of letters after her name. So, and that should be it for the in-house here.
Okay. And moderator, is there anyone online that would like to introduce themselves?
Yes, we have a couple. For anyone who wants to introduce themselves on WebEx, you can either use the raise hand icon or use the Q&A button down at the bottom right. First, I have Sarah Carrasco, and Sarah, I will request to unmute your microphone now.
Good morning. This is Sarah Carrasco, Licensure and Compliance Specialist at William Jessup University. Happy to be here.
All right, and next I have Selena Liu Raphael. And Selena, I will request to unmute your microphone now.
Selena Lou Raphael, the California Alliance of Child and Family Services. I'm the Senior Behavioral Health Policy Advocate. Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, this is moderator. Next, I have Lisa Wenninger. And Lisa, I'll request to unmute your microphone now.
Dr. Lisa Wenninger, an LPCC in private practice, and also founder of a nonprofit called Resonant Equity, which has a mission to help reduce some of the barriers to licensure and increase the quality of continuing education within the mental health profession.
All right, next I have Ben Caldwell, and Ben, I'll request to unmute your microphone now.
Caldwell, LMFT. I'm with California State University Northridge and High Pass Education. Good to be with you.
And lastly, I have Kathy Atkins.
Kathy Atkins from the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. Thank you for having me this morning. I just, as a virtual participant, I wanted to underscore for those in the room that while the audio might be getting fixed, it is super, super hard to hear the folks in the room. So those who might be in the audience wanting to testify, I'd talk loud because we definitely cannot hear you. But again, thanks for having me.
All right, this is the moderator, and it appears that is everyone on WebEx who wish to introduce themselves.
Great. Thank you so much. And before we move on to the consent calendar, I did want to share for the committee and the public that we will not be hearing item 5 today. That item will be rescheduled. So we will just be, once we finish with item 4, we'll move right on to item 6. So with that,
I'm sorry.
we have consent calendar item 3, discussion and possible approval of the October 11th, 2024 Workforce Development Committee meeting minutes. Does any member wish to remove or edit any items from the consent calendar?
Andy, this is Christina. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's hard, but we can hear you. Yeah.
I'd like to make a suggestion before we move forward, and I would like to ask everybody in the audience to turn on their closed caption on the WebEx. That way, if you cannot hear what is being said, I'm hoping that you can read along.
I just did that. That does help.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy.
Okay. Great. Seeing no changes suggested for the consent calendar, do we have a motion? Okay, seeing none, I'll make a motion.
Yes, go ahead, Eleanor. Go ahead.
I motion to approve the October 11th, 24 meeting minutes for the Workforce Development Committee.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Justin Huft, second.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the public?
There are no
in the room?
No in-house room comments? Nope.
Okay. Moderator, do we have any comments online?
This is the moderator, and for our members on WebEx, if you would like to make a public comment, you can click the raise hand icon or the Q&A icon down at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. All right, and seeing no requests, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you. Christina, we're ready for the vote.
Justin Huft,
Yes.
Wendy Strack,
Yes.
Ellen Uribe,
Yes.
Dr. Annette Walker.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. On to item 4, discussion and possible recommendations regarding restructuring the pathway to licensure for licensed marriage and family therapists, licensed clinical social workers, and licensed professional clinical counselors. Roseanne, would you provide us with the overview?
Yes, thank you, Wendy. So this discussion is a continuation of a discussion we've been having at previous meetings about several possible ways to streamline the licensing process in an effort to reduce barriers to licensure. And so some of the things we've discussed so far include possibly adjusting the timing of the clinical exam to be allowing it to be taken earlier in the licensing process so that the exam is not saved until the very end, and then if it takes more time to pass, then it can delay final licensure. Another thing we've discussed is adjusting the timing of the California Law and Ethics exam, allowing it to be taken anytime during registration rather than requiring it to be taken every year until passed. Then we discussed the need to set an age limit for the California Law and Ethics exam, possibly proposing that at 7 years. We've discussed possibly changing the registration number, length, and time supervised experience hours are valid. Both of those are both valid for 6 years now, and so we've discussed possibly changing that to 7 years. And then finally, the possibility of adding an exemption to the prohibition of working in a private practice with a subsequent registration number, and possibly allowing a one-time 2-year extension for one private practice setting. So today's proposal is a continuation of that discussion. This is going to be an ongoing draft, and we're kind of throwing out some ideas and to see what people think of them. And we still need to probably conduct more research and continue consulting with the exam and licensing unit to determine the feasibility of implementation. We also still need to consult with legal counsel once we get a better idea of what shape this proposal is going to take. And so we expect this over the next course of a few next meetings to continue to evolve. Since our last committee meeting in October, we've had discussions with our examination unit and our licensing unit. And there have been some concerns raised about implementing the part of the proposal that would allow the clinical exam to be taken early. And part of the reason for that is that the board might be transitioning to the AMFTRB national exam for the LMFT licensure at the same time. And so the reason that the licensing and exam unit has concerns is a couple of reasons, but both transitioning to a national exam and allowing the clinical exams to be taken early are huge projects and undertakings with a lot of moving parts. So in terms of licensees that are in the exam process, there's concerns about having 2 different major changes going on being confusing for them. And also in terms of programming our Breeze system and making plans for that, while we have 2 different sets of things that are happening on slightly different timelines, there's some major concerns about the ability to smoothly implement that as well. So that is kind of where that discussion went. So we went back and looked at all the different components of the proposal, and we looked at how they would interplay together and how significant they would be in terms of outreach and Breeze programming and things like that. And we proposed, instead of doing all of this in one giant project, seeing what we can do now and then what can be done down the road to try to minimize and avoid confusion and possible unintended consequences. So what we're recommending today is a phased approach where the changes discussed in the previous meetings and the transition to the AMFTRB national exam are completed in 3 phases. In the first phase, changes mostly unrelated to the exam process would be made, or at least changes unrelated to major restructuring of the exam process would be made. So that's the first phase, which is shown in attachment A today, is that language. The second phase would be the transition to the AMFT national exam as the LMFT clinical exam. The board is already in the process of pursuing that particular project. We're pursuing some legislation that would allow us to even possibly consider it via statute. And then the next steps that staff has currently been directed by the board to pursue is working with AMFTRB on the actual logistics of making that happen. So we're in the process of doing that right now. And then the third and final phase of this proposal is where we took out changing the timing of the clinical exams and moved that. So we would, after everything else was implemented, the proposal would be as a third phase, we would change the timing of the clinical exams to allow them to be taken earlier. So that's the current proposal that you see in your packet today. And then I'm going to focus on phase 1 first and talk about that, but then I'm also going to give a brief overview of phase 2 and 3 as well and how those would fit in later. So in phase 1, which is shown today as proposed language in attachment A, does several different things that we think would help streamline the licensing process for people that are working through that in order to kind of remove some barriers. So one of the pieces of the proposal is to change the timing of the California Law and Ethics exams. Right now, associates have to take the California Law and Ethics exam every year and as a condition of their registration renewal until the exam is passed. And so under this proposal, we would allow instead associates to choose when they take the California Law and Ethics exam. It would remain, it would still need to be passed before eligibility for the clinical exam can be obtained, and it would still need to be passed before a subsequent registration number is obtained. But otherwise, an associate who is registered, instead of being required to attempt that exam every year, they would be able to take it when they feel they're ready. And so making this change will prevent delays that we sometimes see with registration renewal when an associate forgets to take the California Law and Ethics exam in any given year, and then they realize that they can't renew their registration. That can cause some problems for them in terms of their continuity of employment, and so that would be eliminated under this proposal. Originally, when this requirement was put in place, it was done for public protection purposes. The thought being that somebody should at least be trying to attempt the California Law and Ethics exam every year, so that they are familiar with California law and ethics while they're a registrant. Staff believes that with the new continuing education requirement that makes associates now have to complete 3 hours of continuing education covering California law and ethics every year as CE requirements. That became effective in 2023. So now that we have that requirement, staff believes that public protection could still be maintained, even if the person's not attempting the law and ethics exam every year. So that's the first proposal. The second piece is we need to place an age limit on the California Law and Ethics exam. That was not done when the exam was restructured back in 2016, and it's going to eventually have some unintended consequences if we don't place an age limit on it. We're proposing an age limit of 7 years because we already have a 7-year age limit on a valid clinical exam passing score. The longer that the California Law and Ethics exam has been offered, which is right now, it's been offered since 2016, the more likelihood that somebody could apply for licensure with a very old passing California Law and Ethics exam score, and the board would have to accept it. And so that is a little bit concerning for public protection purposes. If somebody in 2035 comes to apply for a licensure with a California Law and Ethics score that was earned in 2016, it suggests that possibly they might not have current knowledge in California law and ethics. And so that's why we're proposing the 7-year limit. They would, to obtain a subsequent registration number, the California Law and Ethics exam must have been passed within the past 7 years. When they apply for licensure, the California Law and Ethics exam would need to be no more than 7 years old to avoid very old people coming back with very old scores. Another change that we're proposing is the change in the registration number length and the time supervised experience hours are valid. So right now, a registration number can be renewed 5 times, so it's good for a total of 6 years, and then they have to get a subsequent registration number. And with a subsequent registration number, you can't work in a private practice or professional corporation. Most people we found over the years gain their experience hours in about 3 to 4 years, but there are different hardships and life circumstances that people undergo that causes them sometimes to need to take longer, and sometimes that 6-year rule can cause a hardship for them. The other thing we're proposing is the time supervised experience hours are valid. Right now, supervised experience hours are valid for 6 years. So if you gain an hour 6 years in the past, as it becomes 6 years old, each hour expires. That's to ensure that applicants for licensure have current experience. We are proposing to extend the amount of time supervised experience hours are valid from 6 years to 7 years as well. And the reason for doing this is really to account for life events or circumstances, hardships. Somebody gets sick, somebody takes time off to raise a family. There's a variety of different reasons that somebody might need to take longer or need to take a break. And so this is just allows them a little bit more time to be able to pick up and continue rather than losing hours so quickly. This change would also align the allowable age of experience hours with the age of the clinical and law and ethics exam scores that we're proposing, both 7 years. And that will provide a simpler process when the board eventually transitions to allowing a clinical exam to be taken earlier, because if we eventually allow a clinical exam to be taken earlier, instead of locking hours at the end, which I'll explain later, we would just require all experience hours and exam scores to be no more than 7 years old. And I want to break here to take a little bit of a look at attachment B, because I did some research about what some other states do about their experience hours, and it's kind of all over the place. We have one state I'm seeing, Massachusetts, it looks like it's 8 years. With Florida, they have 5 years with a one-time exception. Some of these boards have one-time exceptions written in, and they have to actually petition the board. Usually those states have very much smaller license populations than our board. We have 150,000 people. These states, sometimes have licensees in the hundreds or low thousands. So they have a little bit more of an opportunity to be able to do something like a petition on the case-by-case basis. We would likely get a large volume of requests. Some boards, a lot of boards are 6 years like we are. Nevada allows hours for 3 years. There's a couple of states, Alaska allows 10 years. There's a couple of states, Arizona and Ohio, that don't have an age limit on experience hours at all. And then I also want to point out one thing that's not in your packet is that when I did some research, the state of Texas is the only one that I could find that actually had an age limit. It was 5 years. And then around 2022, they deleted their age limit. So they went to just allowing the hours for an infinite amount of time. And I reached out to their board administrator to ask them how that was going for them. And it's relatively new for them still. So they had said that they felt the changes made clinical licensure more accessible. They don't have any statistics right now concerning how many applicants meet the requirements now versus they would not have met them before. And they don't have any data about the age of their applicants' supervised experience requirements. They just said they have responded to inquiries where licensees have completed supervised experience years ago, but life circumstances prevented them, and now they want to apply for licensure. So they also added that to their knowledge, they have not received any complaints yet alleging a violation that stemmed from old supervised experience. So that was what they had to say about their experience with making that particular change. So that is the extending the length of time and registration number from 6 to 7 years proposal and research. The other piece of phase one that I want to talk about is the possibility of adding an exception to the prohibition on working in a private practice with a subsequent registration number. That's something that we hear about a lot, that it can be a hardship if somebody has to take time off for a life circumstance, and then they come back and get a subsequent registration number, and they find out that they can't work in a private practice, and maybe that's the only place. Maybe they currently have a job with current clients there, or maybe that's the only job that they can find, but they're not allowed to work in it. So we have discussed this particular provision of law numerous times in my time here, which has been since 2010, and there's a lot of concerns with straight out deleting the prohibition because there's a feeling that it protects associates from exploitation. So there's definitely a desire to keep this provision. The last time we discussed this was in August 2022. The possibility of removing the provision was discussed, but there was still the concerns from the board members and the stakeholders about possible exploitation of associates. So what we're proposing is a more limited approach that could apply for a limited time in instances of hardship. And what we're proposing is the law would continue to generally prohibit associates from working in a private practice with a subsequent associate registration number. However, it would permit an associate with a subsequent registration number to request a one-time 2-year hardship extension. And so with that extension, they could finish gaining their experience hours in one private practice setting if the supervisor and the employer submit a request to the board providing specified information. And that specified information would be basically what agency are you working for, who is your supervisor, why are you requesting this hardship extension? And we're really just looking to make sure that people are not, we don't have certain settings doing this repeatedly. It's really just to help one person out at a time in specific circumstances where they, for whatever reason, that's the only option for them to work. So. And then also you'll see in attachment A, there's some technical cleanup changes, deleting some sections that are no longer needed or obsolete. We want to make a clarification that because some states already allow an earlier taking of a clinical exam score, that when we get out-of-state applicants who come here who don't have hours yet, but they've already passed the clinical exam, we want to clarify in our law that we will accept that. Right now, it's not clear in our law of whether we can accept that or not, which has led to some confusion. So we want to clarify that, for instance, somebody that graduated, took the exam right away and passed it, and now they're here applying for licensure, that will accept that score even though it was taken early, even though the board doesn't grant eligibility to take the clinical exam until all hours are gained. So that's the proposal you see before you today. I wanted to talk briefly about what would happen with the other two pieces of this. So phase 2 would be the adoption of the AMFTRB national exam as the LMFT clinical exam. And that's another really big change that affects our exam process. And phase 1 and phase 2 are pretty independent of each other. They can basically be carried out at the same time. We don't think there'll be a whole lot of hardship or confusion by trying to implement everything in phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time or slightly close together. The board's already moving forward with the legislation. The next steps will be working with AMFTRB, which we're currently doing, and then the final trigger for that will be adopting the regulations that state that the AMFTRB exam in regulations is the board's clinical exam. So that's where that proposal is already kind of moving forward. The last piece, phase 3, would be something that we would pursue later after the other two pieces were already adopted and in place. And that is really kind of a complicated, more of a complication. It's a big change in changing the timing of our exams, clinical exams, to allow them to be taken earlier. And what the proposal is what we discussed last time is permitting the exam to be taken as a registrant once an applicant has completed 875 hours of supervised experience. That's about half of the required 1750 hours of clinical experience required for licensure. There's a lot of different variations of ways that can be done. Some states allow it to be taken right out of school upon graduation. We don't think that ASWB is going to allow their exam to be taken that early. They seemed amenable to a proposal where some of the hours had been completed, kind of with the idea being there's kind of two schools of thought. One, you should wait until all of your hours are completed because, you know, that gives you the most experience and a better shot to pass the exam. Some people just want to take the exam right out of school. So there's kind of differing schools of thought on that. And so this is kind of a compromise. It's saying, you know, let's have some experience hours, but maybe not all the experience hours, so people don't get stuck at the end trying to take the exam and having difficulty passing it. We would need a lot of modifications to our licensing process to implement this change. We have a requirement in regulations right now that an applicant must attempt the clinical exam every year to avoid abandoning the application. That would really need to be deleted because we can't, once somebody starts taking the clinical exam, if they're an associate, we can't really require them to keep taking it every year. That would be probably overly burdensome if they're not ready yet. They don't really need to pass it till the end. So they would get to choose. The idea of allowing choice kind of means that we don't really see a way to require them to take it every year if we're allowing choice. That would mean that if they don't take the exam every year, right now what we do is that when they finish all of their supervised experience hours, they have to get all their 3,000 hours. We lock those hours in and they just keep taking the exam every year till they pass. And whether that takes them 2 years or 10 years, we still accept those hours. They stop expiring once they're in the exam cycle, as long as they take the exam every year. We wouldn't really be able to do that anymore under this new system because we are going to have registrants taking the exam when they feel they're ready. So instead of locking in hours, what we would need to propose is that hours expire gradually as they become 7 years old. So when an hour becomes 7 years old, it expires. There's never any locking in. But on the flip side, we wouldn't have anybody locking in hours indefinitely. That can be a problem now because what happens is that sometimes people have a hardship and they don't take the exam in a given year. And if their hours are 10 years old, then suddenly they lose all their hours. That doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And then that presents an extreme hardship to that person. So it would get rid of that particular hardship problem and hours would just expire as they became 7 years old. That person would need to continue to work under supervision, gaining hours so that they could continue to have their 3,000 hours once they pass the exam and were ready for licensure. So basically under the proposal, everything would need to be 7 years old when they applied for licensure. The clinical exam, the law and ethics exam, and the hours would all need to be no more than 7 years old. And I think, let's see, what else? We would require all education requirements for registration and licensure be met before taking the clinical exam. So you wouldn't be able to have any coursework deficiencies. We would need to do some renaming of application for exam and application for licensure to kind of reference the new process. But really the main kind of hardship in this thing that we're going to have to work out is how to sort of grandfather or transition those people with really old locked hours over to the new system or carve out an exception for them. So this piece of the proposal is pretty complicated and not quite ready to move forward for a number of reasons, which is why we're proposing to hold on to it for a while and really work out the others, see what we can do that's a little bit less complicated, and then really get this in a place where it can work smoothly and everybody's in agreement on it. So that's a lot. I will open it up for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Roseanne. We'll look to my colleagues to see if there are any questions or comments initially. Dr. Walker.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I can't find the raised hand icon here. My apologies. Thank you, Roseanne, for that detailed report. Your investigation is to be commended. I appreciate all the details and you taking the time to look at other models of existing discussions and outcomes that are out there. So the magnitude of this is great. Okay, and I agree with you that it can be complicated. Just in how you rolled out the details, I have a question for you. What are your thoughts about creating like a visual diagram that possibly includes or not a timeline that has the dates or the years? Because this is, like you said, an ongoing living document. Okay. As you were speaking, what came to mind is like when I first came on board 4 years ago, we had a public comment from a licensee that was having issues with this 7-year rule and trying to retake exams to stay current, da 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 da. And here we are 4 years later, and we're really getting to the heart of this conversation. So that's progress, but we can see the timing in this. It takes time, and so I think it would be helpful even for the public and staff as well. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts? Is it possible for you to tag on a visual diagram?
Yeah, I think I could definitely do that, and it might help clarify. So yeah, I can try to put together something like that. Of course, the dates would be estimates because you know, obviously you never know exactly with legislation and regulation exactly what's going to happen down the road, but we can definitely put together an estimate for the next meeting.
Yeah, but we're looking at year 1, possibly year 2, phase 1, phase 2, and those years and things like that. It could be like 3 different diagrams, if you will, based on your proposed phases and things like that. But I think for many of us that are visual, the language is perfect. It's easy to strike a sentence. But for some folks that may not be willing to do all the reading because it is detailed and it is, you know, can be somewhat complicated to comprehend. It's also nice to have those visual moving parts. So if I'm not asking you to do more work, then I hope I'm not asking for too much.
Oh, not at all. I think that's a good idea, and I can definitely put something like that together. And I will also note that yes, this is a very complicated process. Each of these proposals, even in phase 1 that we've listed, are issues that the board has been debating and sort of struggling with for years on how to sort of weigh public protection and, you know, accommodating people with life hardships. And so I really want to make sure that we do this thoughtfully and rolled out, you know, thinking about each thing. This is kind of a lot of things rolled up in one. So I want to make sure that each gets the attention that it needs.
Yeah, it's moving along nicely. Hard work, well appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And you got at some of the questions I had about what do the timelines for each actually look like, and what kind of, like how long are we looking to wait for phase 3 to actually come about? So thank you for that. Mr. Huff.
Yeah, I also want to echo the thanks and gratitude for how much work you've put into this. So I'll start with that. Thank you. I'm wondering why the earlier accessibility to clinical exams is in a later phase. You know, if we're waiting till nearly 2030 for this, that's a long time to be pushing off that, you know, something that we have been talking about for years would open up the pipeline, help more people become licensed. I'm wondering if there is a way to allow exams to be taken earlier in an earlier phase. That seems like an easier task to get to and a relatively critical one we've been working towards.
When we looked at that and when we looked at what it was going to take to reprogram Breeze, and maybe Steve, you can talk to this a little bit more on the details of Breeze, but there was concern about implementing both at the same time, both from the confusing the public and also just having the Breeze changes kind of flow with each other. Steve, I'm going to
and actually it's more than just Breeze. It's the administratively putting this in place would require actually the board to really pivot how it administratively reviews like the hours and such. Currently right now we have a process where, you know, after 3,000 hours they do the review of the hours to confirm that they are good. But then this would be a whole new process that we would have to put in place for the evaluators. Could include additional staff members that we would need. So it is a really big push. It's something that definitely when we started out, that was like the forefront of our thoughts. But when we were getting down and discussing the actual nuts and bolts of it, especially with a possible change later on to the AMFTRB, it was a lot to consider. I'm not saying if the committee has a different opinion, we could probably explore that or maybe present some more information as to why we're kind of doing the 3-phase approach, so that you have a better understanding of what that would entail and what we were considering. But that was, really one of the concerns, and also for the confusion for applicants too. Everything hitting at once might cause a lot of angst. So.
And the other thing that I will add to that is that when we took a look at the items that are in phase 1, those are some things that have been requested in the past that we've been trying to resolve. That the changes are pretty straightforward that we're doing. They don't require a lot of outreach to avoid confusion, or there'll be some, but it's not as huge of an undertaking. It's something that we can do up front rather than delaying. The thought is to not delay everything just to get the early exam, but to work on something and then be working on the early exam at the same time, but have that on a more, because that requires a little bit more thought and care. All of them require thought and care, but that requires a little bit more, and it's not quite ready for prime time to possibly run next year. Be working on that kind of in the background.
And that's where we're kind of like triaging the situation and what we could get done. In the first one, phase 1, we can get those done really quick. And it's not to say that we won't be working on and looking at the early eligibility. So, maybe as we work on it, we can figure ways out to how to bring it online sooner, and have those discussions. So, but I think proposing those phase 1 items, those are things that we know that we can implement easier and that are going to really help out a lot of people going through the process. So I hope that explains a little bit more.
Thank you. Any other questions from board members?
I still have questions, actually.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I appreciate the explanation, Steve. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a tough position because I'm not looking at any staffing. I don't know what the boots on the ground look like, but it also doesn't make sense why some of these changes would take 4 to 6 years to roll out, to shift how like packets are being reviewed to take the exam. So I don't doubt that there will be huge shifts and that that's a lot of work. I am not expecting it to be rolled out this year or next year, but I guess I am not clear why this is a roughly 4 to 6 year process. Again, being removed from what your daily work looks like, I know I must be missing something, but I don't know how I'm missing 4 to 6 years worth of something.
And actually, the diagrams we were kind of talking about, that would actually be a good thing because partially, in part, it's also the legislative and regulatory process that we would have to go through. So, that takes a considerable amount of time. And then once in place, when we have to actually implement the process, it's going to take, a couple. I don't know how long it will take, but if we can diagram that out, we can definitely have another conversation at the next meeting. That would be good, and we can kind of, actually, it's probably good project planning to kind of like see what we could, what the variance is, or what we could probably do or not, and or what reasoning is behind that, and then we can have the committee look that over and we can talk some more about that. But no, I understand what definitely understand what you're saying. So.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but I think what I'm hearing are two main concerns that you're bringing up, Steve. One is that there's a lot of shifting of workloads and more work that would need to be done. And then also this concern about it would be confusing to registrants. I think that the latter is relatively easily addressed by having a clear website that clearly identifies what's going on. To me, that's sort of hand waving a problem away that isn't really real. I would encourage the committee to be pushing this phase 3 into a phase 2, either replacing phase 2 or swapping phase 2 and phase 3, or just having two things in phase 2. I think I'm still missing why this is put off so long. Yeah, and I would encourage us to be aiming for a sooner rollout rather than settling on a later rollout.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you. Eleanor.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Roseanne, and all the others that were involved with putting together this report because it's very comprehensive. I would also echo Justin's suggestion. I don't know if there's a way of doing like a waiver as we figure this out, but that could be a suggestion. The other thing I was going to ask is, since we're in the process of doing this and we're also over the LEPs, I know that's a whole other topic, but I was just curious how that would fit in,
The LEPs are a little bit different because they don't have a separate law and ethics exam, and they have a little bit of a different process in terms of gaining hours. So we need to examine LEPs separately. My guess is that probably because they don't have the 6-year rules except for how long hours are good, we would probably extend their hours to 6 years, or from 6 years to 7 years as well. But a lot of this does not apply to LEPs the same way.
Okay, I think I'm just looking at it in the long term, like if maybe we might need to consider how they might be affected versus, because from what I understand, our LEPs they're able to supervise some of the people in these other areas, correct?
Say it one more time, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I guess I'm just kind of curious if LEPs somehow later on might need to be included, versus like starting them from the beginning. But anyway, that, like I said, it might be a discussion for later. So
we will definitely look at once we have something decided on, and we'll see what can be. The 6 years to 7 years probably applies to LEPs. We would need to, based on what the final, if this language was accepted, we would need to look at how that affects LEPs separately, just because their licensing process is so different and it doesn't have the same sort of problems that are highlighted here that that typically come up for LEPs because they don't gain hours in the same way.
Any other questions from board members before we go to public comment?
Not a question, but one last comment.
Okay, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't say this before, but I do think someone on the committee, you should note this. I think these are all really important to be pursuing. So I do want to make that very clear and definitive that all of these changes are important and are moving us towards these goals we have talked about. So while I have concerns about the timeline, I do want to note that I think that all of these changes should be moved forward on.
Thank you. Do we have any comments from the public in the room there?
Yes, we do.
Hello again. I'm going to take this off and hopefully the audio is coming through okay, so I'm going to speak
A little louder. It's good. Okay. Well, hello. My name is Shanti Ezrin. I'm with CAMFT. I want to start just by thanking Roseanne for your presentation and thanking staff again for all of your work on these proposals. There's a lot of moving parts to all of these large-scale changes, and first and foremost, really just want to acknowledge the workload that these changes will put on BBS and to implement. That being said, we really do appreciate the strategic planning around these 3 phases. So I want to go through each of the 3 phases, starting with phase 1. We are supportive of the changes to the licensing process as proposed in concept. It will be very important when we move into implementation that we continue to evaluate how these changes, for example, such as the 7-year age limit for the L&E exam, will impact associates, so that we continue to ensure a fair and equitable licensing process for providers while balancing that consumer protection piece. One need for clarification that we do have is on phase 1D. Just really want to make sure that we understand the 2-year hardship extension is on top of what I suppose will be referred to as the 7-year rule. That's in phase 1C instead of the 6-year rule as it stands now. And continuing on that line of thought, this is something that is more down the line, but any guidelines, any FAQs or appropriate examples for when the hardship extension would really be appropriate would help providers and lessen the workload on BBS staff. So moving on to phase 2, the adoption of the AMFT RB national exam is something that CAMFT has continued to express really strong support of, and thank you again to staff and to the board members for continuing to prioritize the movement of this without any undue delay. And then I'll close out with phase 3. Again, just want to recognize the workload that all of these changes will put on BBS to implement. Yes, I think this was already covered. As resources of the board and staff permit, we would encourage you to continue refining the proposals under phase 3 and work through those requisite pieces so that when it is time to pursue implementation, everything can happen expeditiously. Thank you.
And I'll just answer your question, Shanti, related to your hardship extension. It would be in addition to the 7 years. The 6 years would become the 6-year registration would become 7, and then there would be the hardship extension.
Got it. Thank you, Roseanne.
Hello, can you hear me better when I take it off? Thank you. Okay, this is Christine Tippett, and thank you so much for putting all the effort into this. And it does respond to some of the questions in D on phase 1 that speaks to the hardship that leads to some people getting subsequent registration numbers. The only question I am asking is if in the prohibition to working in a private practice, could it be a private practice or the setting that is a professional corporation? Could that be included? Because the questions that come up, and I do understand people should not be exploited. If that could be included so that they would understand when I explain to them as a supervisor, you should not be exploited, just as your clients should not be exploited, then they would understand that. And that would make really good sense as we are discussing this and it is moving forward, because you are doing a great job. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. And I'll just add to that. The language as it's drafted, it's actually on page 414 of the memo. We did include that the hardship extension can be for either a private practice or a professional corporation. Yes. I would also add that it can be, we wrote that language, it's kind of subtle to see it, but that language is written so that somebody with a subsequent number can request the 2-year extension anytime. So they don't have to do it right at the beginning when they're applying for a subsequent number. They can shoot, they might be a year into having a subsequent number and they might say, oh, I can only get a job at a private practice. I want to use my extension. They only get to do it once. So if they don't get to do it again, but they can do it anytime they want while having a subsequent number.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments in person, moderator, do we have any comments online?
This is the moderator. If you would like to make a comment on this item, you can click the raise hand icon or use the Q&A feature down at the bottom. And I have a request from Ben Caldwell. Ben, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak in a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you. Good morning. Ben Caldwell, MFT. I want to second the thanks to Roseanne for all the detailed explanation here. And as Board Member Huft said, these are all worthwhile and important changes. So regardless of what the timing winds up looking like, certainly all of these are worth pursuing, and thanks for your efforts to do so. My comment's going to largely align with the comments from Mr. Huft. As he noted, all of these proposed changes are important. Transitioning to the national MFT exam is a worthwhile change. I think all of us continue to support, but we want to be clear on its limited impact. It will allow for somewhat easier portability of licensure for some MFTs moving to some states. It does not meaningfully advance equity in the licensing process or add clinicians to the licensed mental health workforce in this time of very great workforce need. On the other hand, allowing individuals to take the clinical exam earlier does do both of these things. For that reason, it seems like that should be the higher priority. I'm certainly empathetic to the complexity involved in all these moving parts and the workload considerations there. So I guess some questions on timing. Would it be possible to work on steps 1 and 3 simultaneously while the other entities like AMFTRB are doing some of the advanced work that needs to be done to implement the national exam? Would it be possible to run legislation and regulations for all of these phases expediently while writing in some flexibility on implementation dates depending on when board and staff are ready to implement? And related to Dr. Walker's point about timing, is there any possibility that any of this is going to go into a 2025 legislative vehicle, or is all of it needing to wait until at least next year to go through the legislature? Thank you.
Yes, steps 1 and 3, we've actually already drafted a big part of step 3. You saw it at the last meeting. There's some pretty significant details that still need to be worked out on that, on the how to transition people that are already in the system. So we need to continue to look at that, and we can continue to look at that in committee as we're working on the other language. Yes. In terms of what the timeline on this is generally, well, we didn't really know until it sounds like everybody's pretty supportive of the language and shown in attachment A. You never know how that's going to go. This is kind of some very major changes on some topics that we've been wanting to make changes on for a while, but couldn't necessarily, some of the solutions were controversial or not supported. So if there's support for this and it continues to move through the committee process as is, and there's not a lot of disagreement on it how it moves forward or what it looks like, then yes, I anticipate it's the pretty much for legislation this year. No, it's not ready to go yet for this year. That's already has to be pretty much introduced by mid-February. We're not there yet. We don't want to rush things and have unintended consequences later. This is something that, at least the attachment A piece, would be something that we're looking at to run it next year. That doesn't mean we can't be working on language for the other one. In fact, we need to be working on language because there's a lot to be worked out with sort of the grandfathering or transition phase for that. I don't know the logistics of doing the AMFTRB already allows early exams, so it's kind of a natural fit to do it after that's already in place. And I don't think that we're going to be ready for that piece quite as quickly as it sounds like we might be ready for the attachment A changes. Steve, do you want to add anything?
I'm not sure what else I can add. I think you explained it pretty much appropriately. So.
Also add that the next steps. So we need to still run this logistically. There's a few logistics on attachment A that need to be worked out. We need to run it through our legal. We need to run it through licensing to kind of talk about how certain things would be implemented and if the language needs to be tweaked slightly. So I would anticipate this goes back at least one more workforce committee. It would still need to go to P&A and board. That can probably all be done this year. If people like it, then yes, we are looking at legislation potentially for next January.
Yeah. I guess, can you help clarify which pieces would be in that legislation? I guess that's where I'm getting lost, and that's where that kind of diagram might be helpful about like what pieces go to what others at what times.
Yeah. So attachment A, everything you see in attachment A is what we're thinking for legislation for. It would have to be next year in terms of approval, because the board still has to approve it. P&A still has to approve it. In terms of phase 2, which is the AMFTRB exam, we're already going to be introducing legislation to make the statutory changes needed for that this year. Hopefully in our sunset bill, we're waiting for confirmation on that. So that you should see very shortly. That needs to be done this year in order to even allow us to consider taking the AMFTRB exam as a clinical exam. Then the trigger for that that we're working on in the meantime, and that you'll be seeing at the February board meeting, is the actual text of the regulations. So that leaves phase 3, which we would need. There's a little bit more logistics and work that needs to be done there that we would need to continue working on. That would probably not be on the table to run until sometime after next year.
When would that actually kick in? And I guess with the comments from board member Huft, I'm also curious, does that mean we're talking about, waiting 5 years or more before phase 3 takes effect?
Not necessarily, but it depends on how the legislative process and the regulatory process are each about a year on their own. And then once that year is up, it takes the effective date is a few months later. So if attachment A was to run in 2026, we're looking at a 2027 effective date. If the other one was to run a year behind it, then we could be looking at 2028 for the other piece. It just kind of depends on how. That's assuming that everybody loves it and there's no, that it passes the legislature, that it's great. There's no debate on any, and that doesn't necessarily always happen with legislation. So it's not necessarily, these are huge changes. They're not necessarily a slam dunk.
Yep.
If they encounter opposition, and we might have to kind of go back to the drawing board and look at things. So, but assuming everything goes well with attachment A, we think we can run it next year.
And we have been, that's the one thing with the MFTRB exam. We are definitely looking at ways to fast track that with the regulation and kind of timing and everything. So once again, I think when we can diagram this out, we can have a better idea of or a better conversation as to kind of what we're looking at and the process and, a possible ideal timeline, or some, maybe we can throw in there too, just kind of a risky timeline, and show you what we're kind of considering so you have a better idea.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Next I have Kathy Atkins, and Kathy, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Good morning. This is Kathy Atkins with CAMPT. I want to just echo, Shanti did a nice job of expressing CAMPT's position on the various phases at a high level assessment. I want to acknowledge, as many others have, that it is the BBS is being asked by board, committees, stakeholders, including CAMPT, for very worthwhile goals that are huge and complicated in implementation. And so I want to acknowledge that and thank the staff for all their work. And recognize that there's probably a lot of hiccups and convoluted areas that make implementation harder than what it seems to all of us on the outside. Certainly, all of us would like to see all these great initiatives move forward as quickly as possible. I guess what I just wanted to add to what Shanti said is, as a stakeholder that is asking for one of the big asks, I would offer to the BBS staff, for those of us who are asking for these changes, which are immense across the board, is there anything we as stakeholders who are saying hurry up and do it, what can you put back to us? What can we help do? Is there anything on our end that we can do to help ensure a more speedy process, so that not everything falls, into one or two or three people's plates and then everything just takes longer. So just saying thank you, recognizing the immensity of all this, and just offering, CAMFT is more than happy to help if we can, where we can, and just please, know we're an asset. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
All right, this is the moderator. Next I have Selena Raphael. And Selena, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you so much. And I really just echo what everybody else has said. Just thank you so much for the work that you have done on this and all of the background details. It's super helpful. And also just really want to echo everyone else's support and comments. Just as Kathy was mentioning Shanti's comments, just was thinking about what else we could offer as the California Alliance and any support we could offer in expediting this process, as well as, of course, we're still really trying to help the workforce here. So yeah, just wanted to offer just what Kathy offered as well. Any help that the California Alliance can do to expedite the process. Thank you so much.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears that was all our requests for public comment on WebEx.
Great, thank you. Looking again to board members, see if there's any follow-up from public comment, but it seems to me like we're all pretty much on the same page about advancing the initiatives that we can as quickly as we can, and making sure that we're setting up our own regulatory barriers, implementing something if we move faster than we think. But we do know things move slowly. The legislative and regulatory process is not always a quick one. With that, seeing no other, Roseanne or Steve, is there anything you want to do to, anything you want to comment on to close this item?
No, we'll run this by legal, and we'll work out a few more details on attachment A, and we'll come up with a visual diagram that, like Annette suggested, kind of phasing things out by phase and also by year, and we'll bring it back to the next meeting.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item 6. Discussion and possible recommendation regarding a holistic review of the in-state and out-of-state education requirements for licensed marriage and family therapists and licensed professional clinical counselors. Steve, will turn this over.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure. Okay, great. So, since we're doing the pathway changes, we've thought we might as well do another big change here and try to implement this. And what I'm going to introduce here is talking about, like it says, doing a holistic review of the LMFT and LPCC's education requirements for licensure. With the main goal is to eliminate some of the inequities that exist between in-state, out-of-state applicants, and definitely eliminate the confusion of the requirements. And lastly, to try to make a fair and consistent pathway while maintaining, the high standards that California has for licensure and education requirements. How did we get to the current education requirements? That's what I'll give you a little background here. I don't really explain before November 2004 what the education requirements were, but it was definitely, I guess, in a real basic terms, easier to understand. You had the coursework requirements, how many hours you needed, and the actual description of the coursework, the content was more simple. But in November 2004, the California voters enacted the Mental Health Services Act, MHSA, and that transformed the state's mental health services. It emphasized culturally and linguistically competent approaches, community involvement and treatment of serious mental health, a client-driven mental health system, and a wellness focus, which includes the concept of recovery and resilience. So that change necessitated us to look at the requirements for the LMFT. At the time, in 2004, we did not have the LPCC licensure. So in July 2006, the board established the MFT Education Committee to examine the curriculum requirements and assess their relevance to the contemporary MFT practice as it existed under MHSA. That led to Senate Bill 33, which became law in 2010, and this bill updated curriculum requirements for LMFT licensure, increasing the number of required degree units from 48 to 60 semester units. But at the time, it built in actually greater flexibility for schools to determine the number of hours spent on most topics. That was in recognition that change would cause could cause a lot of issues, and it was to mediate the problems that transitioning to new coursework would have on schools. And additionally, they were trying to look at how to incorporate the public mental health principles from the MHSA into schools. In 2010, Senate Bill 788 was passed, and this set forth licensure requirements for LPCCs, and those requirements took into effect the MHSA principles that were incorporated into the LMFT coursework requirements. And so the LMFT and LPCC coursework requirements were very similar at that time in 2010. In 2014, the law was revised again to kind of work on some of the issues we were having with out-of-state applicants. And it was to remedy some of the issues. We were having problems with out-of-state applicants trying to come into California. At some point, it was almost impossible for them to get in. So where are we now? Current challenges. There is inequities currently between out-of-state and in-state applicants. For in-state applicants, all educational requirements must be met. For most applicants, all education requirements must be met before an associate registration is granted. For LMFT applicants who began graduate studies on or after August 1st, 2012, the law does not permit any coursework to be remediated post-degree, and LPCC law permits very limited content to be remediated post-degree. This means that some applicants, even if missing one course topic, would have to obtain a completely new degree to qualify. In contrast, out-of-state applicants can remediate many more deficiencies, including some after you actually receive your registration. So that's part of one of the reasons why we're wanting to do this holistic review and possibly go down this pathway of really looking at in-depth for the education requirements. Additionally, internally, when we're looking at transcripts and evaluating educational coursework, it's been with the increased use of remote learning. It's really difficult to determine what's an in-state degree and what's an out-of-state degree. Part of that is we have historically, before right? And not necessarily just before COVID, but before the kind of the push for remote learning. It was easy. It was like brick and mortar. We'd say, oh, you're California, you're probably going to be teaching California requirements. Well, that's not the case anymore. So that's another impetus for us to look at the educational requirements and see how we can actually make them, align them with the current kind of standards of education. So the proposal here is to address these challenges. It's going to be a long process, but we really have a couple steps that we want to look at, or a couple things that we want to do. And the first is definitely to do the comprehensive review and to evaluate the education requirements for in-state and out-of-state programs, focusing on timing, length, and content. And then looking at other jurisdictions to see how they actually have their educational requirements in law, and looking at other ideas. So the holistic review, I think we can bring that back definitely within, maybe at the next meeting, to get that going so we can have a conversation about that. The next step would be to look at all those requirements that we have currently and try to standardize. I don't know if standardize is the right word. I'm going to put it out there, though, standardize requirements, and look at the feasibility of making coursework standardized across both LMFT and LPCCs, recognizing that there is core content that definitely, it should be required of there's core content that should be required for each scope. There's things that LMFT coursework should contain that LPCC coursework might not contain. So we would look at the core content of each degree, or core content of the requirements and what's necessary for each license type, and then look at those coursework or content that could actually be standardized across both. I hope that makes sense. The next thing, I think that one of the topics that we also were going to want to look at in a future meeting would be the approval of educational requirements. Currently, California institutions can send in their coursework and their syllabi, and we will look at them and we will give them it's not necessarily technically an approval, but we will say that those degree requirements, those coursework requirements at this time meet the educational requirements for licensure. It's technically, we try not to call it an approval process, but that's what we're looking at, kind of discussing how we could actually move towards making it more of an approval process. The reason that we would want to do that, it definitely helps with not only, it helps the actual applicants or students understand what institutions they can go to and actually get actually be successful. If they graduate, they can become licensed. And then also for the application processing for the staff, trying to come up with a better way where we can actually acknowledge a institution's coursework without having to review every single transcript that comes through, which is it's pretty, since we do get about 8,000 applications a year, that can be a very tedious process. The last thing that we'll definitely have to look at is course timing, and that is to what I was talking about earlier, the inequities. Some applicants can make up their coursework as a registrant. In-state, you have to make it up, or you have to have it completed before you get licensure. We'll definitely have a discussion on what the committee thinks about, timing. Should we require all coursework to be completed before you receive a registration number, or can you make up some of those after you become a registrant? And lastly, this kind of goes with what Christy had been talking about, and what it was our item number 5 that we're not discussing today. It kind of wraps into this whole discussion here, is talking about if you can make up coursework, is that going to be, are we going to require continuing education, or are we going to require graduate level courses? So kind of exploring that to see what everyone's comfortable with. So this is just kind of a cursory review. I think the first step for us for the committee, where we would do a kind of a presentation of the looking at the coursework that we currently have in place, diagramming that out, and then looking at other jurisdictions, and then we can have that discussion. I believe at the next committee meeting, kind of start that discussion and see where we want to go with that. Yeah, so that's what we had in thoughts, and open for comments and questions, please.
Thank you, Steve. Board members, any comments or questions? Seeing none at this moment. Steve, are there any comments in the room?
Yes.
Hello again. I'll do this. Hello again, Shanti Ezrin with CAMP. Steve, thank you so much for your presentation. We're in support of the proposed holistic review of education requirements to make sure that the content is up to date, that the content is appropriate, and ensures an equitable pathway for licensure for all applicants while maintaining consumer protection. Looking at a couple of the pieces there in the proposed plan, like looking at educational programs, aligning course timings for the various licensures before associate registration, and allowing out-of-state applicants to fulfill certain requirements through CE courses are definitely welcome considerations that ensure consumer protection and are appropriate training for our providers. So all that being said, we're looking forward to seeing the results and what else comes out of this holistic review. Thank you.
And that's it in-house.
Okay. Moderator, do we have any comments online?
Yes, this is a moderator. For members of the public on WebEx, if you would like to make a comment on this item, you can click the raise hand icon or the Q&A icon down at the bottom of your WebEx screen. And we do have a couple requesting. First, I have Ben Caldwell. Ben, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Good morning. Thank you. Ben Caldwell, MFT, and thank you, Steve, for the details here. I echo Shanti's support for doing this review. It's now been more than a decade since the last comprehensive review of these requirements, so it's probably time to take another look. I would express some mild concern about the stated goal of standardizing educational requirements, although, Steve, your explanation here was really helpful in recognizing that there are often good reasons why there should be differences between the professions. As we've seen with other regulations, sometimes there are differences between professions that don't appear to have much of a rationale behind them, and standardizing in those areas can be helpful. I would note that one area of substantive difference is the role of program accreditation between the two professions, with CACREP accreditation playing a much more meaningful role in governing California counseling programs than COAMP accreditation plays in governing California MFT programs. And that can impact some of the content requirements as well. COAMP accreditation has certainly grown, but still represents a minority of MFT programs in the state. Ultimately, I, and I'm sure a lot of others in the academic and clinical world, would be eager to contribute to this process in whatever way it will be most useful. So we're eager to see this move forward and ready to contribute. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Next, I have Sarah Carrasco. And Sarah, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Yes, Steve, thank you for your work on this presentation. Truly phenomenal. And we echo all of the support to the proposed plan, primarily in support of, I know we can't call it approval of education programs, but some type of an approval that would greatly assist in the associate registration process and cutting down those time frames. So thank you for that.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears there are no further requests on WebEx.
Thank you very much. Before we leave this item, just checking with some board members again, see if there's any other comments following public comment. Okay. All right, thank you.
I would say this is review. No, I would just say that they're updating the concerns for just making sure that the content is up to date would be very important. Also, I feel there's some good reasons to start even looking at accepting the CEs for courses. Also, in a sense, like this to help streamline the process with maybe courses that might qualify, in a sense, like the colleges do in an articulation agreement. Maybe that's something that we can do to help streamline it. And thanks for your work on this.
Thank you. Okay. Seeing no other comments, thank you, Steve, for the presentation. Move on to item 7, update regarding the Workforce Development Action Plan. And Steve, we're still with you.
Yes, thanks. You know, in the lieu of kind of time management here, really the report is in front of you. It's just kind of a checkbox of what we've been doing currently. As you noticed, I put down there that we have discussed those certain topics in today's meeting. Additionally, we did kind of an amendment to the original workforce development goals that we set, and it was suggested at the last meeting that we put the goal of pursuing increase in financial support available to applicants and associate should be bumped up to kind of a short-term goal. So that kind of changed in the attachment there for you. So just as the overview of what we've been doing in the committee, and that's there for you to review and ask any questions.
Great, thank you. Board members, Dr. Walker.
Yes, thank you so much, Steve and staff, for working on this item. I'm excited again to see this move along as swiftly as it has since taking the survey. Steve, just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts possibly about adding a projected cost, if any, this impact on staff hours, if any, and providing some kind of timelines, if any, as well? What are your thoughts about that?
As opposed to like the whole committee and the work we do, or into the certain items?
So, yeah, just on certain items, like you have the short-term goals and the long-term goals. Could you, in addition to what you've provided, add possibly any projected costs, if any?
It would be kind of really tough to kind of estimate that, because I'm not sure of the the hours the hours it's going to take and the staff involved. It would really be tough to project that, unfortunately.
Okay.
I mean,
how about this? I'm not asking for the specifics, but you could even put a dollar sign if you know that it is going to require funding.
Oh, yeah, I mean, definitely.
Yeah, to move the item along, so.
It could actually, I mean, if, looking at kind of in a more project management type of way, I could, looking at some of these projects, if it's going to require additional even personnel possibly, I mean, does it require more money, more personnel, or something like that?
Yeah.
We couldn't, I think I know what you're saying.
Yeah, great. That's all I'm asking. I know you don't have specifics, but it is important to moving forward. We're looking at budget, we're looking at staffing to do potential outreach and things like that. So we just want to stay, I think, ahead of the possibilities.
What I can try is actually, and the one that comes to mind is the additional, the goal of increasing financial support. You could probably list next to that, this will require, regulation. It could require additional staff to implement. The kind of the resources, I think, is what you're
exactly.
Will that require?
Okay.
Yes, and one word resources. Yes, okay, great. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from board members? Okay. Seeing none, any comments in the room, Steve?
No.
No? Okay. Moderator, do we have any comments online?
This is the moderator for members of the public on WebEx. If you would like to make a comment on this item, you can click the raise hand icon or the Q&A button down at the bottom of your WebEx screen. And I have a request from Ben Caldwell. And Ben, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak with a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you again, Ben Caldwell, MFT, and Steve, thank you for your work on this. I had suggested this in the October committee meeting and just want to repeat the request here. Can we add to this plan as a long-term goal, identifying and reducing disparities in the licensing process? We want to make sure we have a mental health workforce that looks like California and is equipped to meet all the needs of California's populations. I think that would be a worthwhile goal for this committee. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. Appears there are no further requests for public comment.
Thank you. And looking at fellow committee members, I think the suggestion of adding that goal to our plan is a good one. You know, it's been a big topic of discussion for this group, so I think it makes sense that it might be in our action plan. If there are no questions, Steve will add for our next review of this.
Yep, I can put that in there.
Thank you. Okay. Seeing no other comments, we will move on to item 8, suggestions for future agenda items. Do we have any board members with suggestions for future meetings? Okay, seeing none, do we have any members of the audience with this future agenda item?
None in house.
Okay, moderator, do we have anyone online?
This is the moderator, and for members of the public on WebEx, if you would like to make a comment on this item, you can click the raise hand icon or the Q&A icon down at the bottom. All right, and it appears there are no requests on WebEx.
Thank you. Moving on to 9, public comment for items not on the agenda. As a reminder, the board discuss or take action on it or raised during this section, except to decide whether to place the matter on a future meeting. Do we have any board members with comments not on the agenda? Seeing none, do we have any members? Oh wait, Eleanor?
No, I'm just wondering on, again, the LEPs. I just want to make sure there's not anything that might be missing that we would fall behind on as far as, like, so we have like the updates with the LPCC, LMFP, and I'm just wondering if there's anything that might need to be looked at with the LEPs just to make sure they don't fall behind and we have to kind of look at it later on.
We'll definitely take that into consideration to look at when we're looking at those.
Thank you. Do we have any audience members with comments for items not on the agenda?
Oh, no. Sorry, none here.
Okay. Moderator, do we have any online?
This is the moderator, and for members of the public on WebEx, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please click the raise hand icon or the Q&A button down at the bottom. And I do have a request from Ben Caldwell. Ben, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak and a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Thank you. Ben Caldwell, MFT. I know it's come up in a couple of different contexts this morning, and I just want to express gratitude to board staff. I know that you're working on significant issues here that have an awful lot of moving parts. I really appreciate your diligence in making sure that all of these things are addressed thoughtfully and well. I know we're not just talking about technicalities here. We're talking about significant changes that would impact an awful lot of people. So while I, like any stakeholder, would like everything to be done immediately, I also greatly appreciate that you're working to make sure that it's done correctly. So I just wanted to say thank you to board staff for that.
All right, this is the moderator. There are no further requests for public comment.
Great, thank you. And that brings us to item 10, adjournment. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. As a reminder, our next board meeting will be February 27th and 28th in Sacramento, and we hope to see you all then.